The courtroom buzzed with a thick, oppressive energy, every eye locked onto the young man standing alone at the defendant's table. Michael Turner's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the cuffs of his cheap, wrinkled shirt, a stark contrast to the sharp suits surrounding him. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice barely rose above a whisper. "I didn't do this," he said. No one listened. In the crowd, a woman wept quietly, clutching a photograph of Jessica Monroe, the girl whose life had ended in tragedy. The prosecution smirked confidently, their case built on shaky, circumstantial evidence that nobody seemed willing to question. The judge's gavel struck like a gunshot, sealing Michael's fate with a harsh finality that echoed through the marble halls. Outside, reporters shouted over each other, eager to spin the story for tomorrow's front page. Inside, Michael's world collapsed in slow motion. He turned, briefly catching Emily Sanders' tear-filled eyes from the gallery, a fleeting moment of human connection before being led away. But buried deep in the dusty corners of the evidence room, hidden and ignored, was a single file that could have changed everything, if only someone had cared enough to find it in time. Before we dive deeper into Michael's unbelievable journey, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. Join a community that believes every story matters, every truth deserves a voice. Don't miss out. Each week, we uncover real cases that will challenge everything you think you know. Michael Turner had never been the kind of man who attracted much attention. At 27, he lived a life of quiet routines and modest dreams in the sleepy town of Brookhaven, where change came slow and suspicion came easy. Every morning at precisely 6:30, Michael unlocked the doors to Weller's Market, a small grocery store where he had worked since he was a teenager. Locals knew him as polite, dependable, and almost painfully shy. A young man who preferred listening to speaking and often got lost stacking cans in neat, perfect rows. His life outside of work was even quieter. Michael lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment above an old hardware store, sharing his space with Max, a golden retriever mix he had rescued from a shelter 3 years earlier. Evenings were simple: microwave dinners, reruns of crime dramas, and late-night study sessions at the kitchen table, where he pored over thick textbooks on criminal justice. Michael dreamed of becoming a lawyer someday, not for glory, but to stand beside the ones no one believed. Ironically, it would be his own voice that went unheard when he needed it most. He wasn't entirely alone, though. Emily Sanders had been Michael's friend since high school, one of the few people who truly saw him. She described him as the kind of guy who would fix your flat tire in the pouring rain and never ask for anything in return. Emily often dragged him to the town's charity events, pushing him to step outside his shell even when he resisted. Their bond was quiet but strong, woven through years of late-night talks, missed opportunities, and unspoken hopes. To the casual observer, Michael's life might have seemed uneventful, even dull. But beneath that ordinariness lived a man of principle. He had seen firsthand how easily people were judged by appearances, how whispers could ruin reputations, how justice could bend under the weight of fear. These lessons had shaped him into someone who believed fiercely in fairness, in second chances, and in the simple decency of treating people right. It was this belief that made him volunteer every Saturday at the local food bank, even when he could barely afford his own groceries. There were warning signs, small tremors in the earth beneath his feet, but Michael was too trusting to notice. A sideways glance from a customer, a casual joke made at his expense, a shift in the way some neighbors crossed the street rather than say hello. He told himself he was imagining things, that paranoia didn't suit him. But in Brookhaven, once doubt took root, it grew fast. And Michael Turner was about to find himself at the heart of a storm he could neither predict nor escape. For most of his life, Michael Turner had clung to one simple hope: to make something better of himself. It wasn't ambition in the traditional sense. Michael didn't dream of flashy cars or a big house in the city. What he wanted was quieter, more personal. He wanted to matter, to do something good enough that when people spoke his name, they spoke it with respect, not suspicion or pity. For years, that dream had a very specific shape. He would become a lawyer. Not the kind that made headlines, but the kind that showed up for the forgotten, the marginalized, the wrongly accused. The irony of it would later haunt everyone who knew him. He spent his evenings after long shifts at Weller's Market, buried in textbooks borrowed from the town's crumbling library. Michael loved the law, not because he trusted it, but because he believed it could be trusted if the right people held it accountable. He believed in fairness, in justice, even when it was hard to find examples of either in the world around him. Money was the biggest obstacle. Tuition fees were crushing, and even with scholarships, the debt would be suffocating. Michael wasn't afraid of hard work. He picked up odd jobs on weekends, mowing lawns, fixing broken fences, unloading deliveries for local shops, anything to add a few extra dollars to his college savings. Every week, he deposited a small, hard-earned sum into a dusty savings account labeled simply Law School. Emily Sanders cheered him on relentlessly. She dragged him to university open houses, proofread his application essays, and even researched affordable schools for him. Sometimes, over lukewarm coffee at the diner where they spent countless Saturday mornings, Emily would lean across the table and say, "You're going to get out of here, Michael. You're going to change lives." And for a little while, he believed her. Brookhaven, however, wasn't the kind of town that encouraged escape. It was a place where people stayed in their lanes, lived the lives expected of them, and quietly resented anyone who dared dream bigger. Michael tried to ignore the murmurs, the sly jokes about Big Shot Turner, thinking he was too good for Weller's Market. He reminded himself that people only mocked what they didn't understand. Still, the weight of their skepticism hung heavy. One crisp autumn morning, Michael mailed his application to the University of North Carolina's School of Law. It felt like dropping a message into a bottle and casting it into a vast, indifferent sea. When the acceptance letter arrived 6 weeks later, Michael stared at it for a long time before daring to open it. He was in, conditional on financial aid approval, but in. He folded the letter neatly, slipped it into his desk drawer, and sat in stunned silence for hours. That night, he and Emily celebrated with cheap pizza and dollar store champagne. For the first time in his life, Michael allowed himself to imagine a future not defined by limitations, but by possibilities. The walls of his small apartment seemed to expand. The air felt lighter. He dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, the universe had finally decided to meet him halfway. But life in Brookhaven wasn't finished with Michael Turner. Not yet. The murder of Jessica Monroe happened 3 weeks later. Jessica had been a rising star in the community, a college freshman home for the holidays, beloved for her volunteer work and infectious laugh. Her death sent shockwaves through Brookhaven, and the demand for swift justice was immediate and unforgiving. People were scared, angry, and desperate for someone to blame. Michael, shy and socially awkward, with few close ties and fewer alibis, quickly found himself in the crosshairs of suspicion. He didn't realize it at first. There were whispers behind his back at the market, customers avoiding his checkout lane, even old friends crossing the street to avoid eye contact. Emily warned him gently that the town was looking for a scapegoat. Michael, ever the optimist, laughed it off. "Let them talk," he said. "I have nothing to hide." He believed that. He believed the truth would protect him. He had no idea how wrong he was. It started with a rumor, small, almost invisible, like a crack in a windshield. A neighbor mentioned seeing Michael walking near the park the night Jessica Monroe disappeared. Another claimed he always seemed off, too quiet, too withdrawn. It didn't take long for these fragments of paranoia to snowball into something far more dangerous. In a town as tightly wound as Brookhaven, fear spread faster than facts. Detectives arrived at Weller's Market one afternoon, pulling Michael aside under the curious gaze of shoppers and co-workers. They asked a few questions at first. Where was he on the night Jessica was killed? Had he ever spoken to her? Did he know anything? Michael answered calmly, confidently, believing honesty would shield him. He didn't have a perfect alibi. He'd been home alone, studying with no one to corroborate his story but Max, his dog. Within days, Michael noticed a shift. Customers no longer smiled at him. His boss, Mr. Weller, began scheduling him for fewer shifts, citing business being slow. Emily was the only one who remained steadfast, checking on him daily, reassuring him that it was all just temporary. Michael wanted to believe her, but doubt had already rooted itself in the minds of the townspeople, and it was growing. The police built a narrative that, at first glance, seemed airtight. Jessica's body had been found near a trail that Michael sometimes used to walk Max. A security camera 2 blocks away captured a figure wearing a dark hoodie on the night of her death. Michael owned a hoodie like that. It didn't matter that half the town did too. What mattered was that it fit the story people wanted to believe. A search warrant was issued for Michael's apartment. Police combed through his belongings, seizing his computer, his clothes, even Max's leash. They found nothing incriminating. But in the court of public opinion, innocence wasn't compelling. Drama was. Headlines splashed Michael's face across the local news, branding him person of interest. The caption might as well have read, "Guilty." The real blow came when a former co-worker, desperate for attention, told reporters that Michael had once gotten angry when a customer accused him of shortchanging her. "They said he had a temper," the co-worker claimed. "They said he could snap." Michael could hardly recognize the portrait being painted of him. He wasn't violent. He wasn't cruel. But each half-truth and exaggerated anecdote added brushstrokes to an image that he couldn't erase. Fear poisoned everything. Neighbors who once waved now crossed the street. Parents pulled their children closer when he passed by. His landlord taped an eviction notice to his door, citing community discomfort as the reason. Even Weller's Market, the place that had been his refuge for a decade, let him go. Michael stood in the empty apartment, staring at the bare walls, feeling like a ghost in a life that had been stolen from him. Emily begged him to leave town, to stay with her family in another state until things cooled down. But Michael refused. Running would only make him look guilty. He would stay, face the accusations, prove his innocence. He had faith in the law, in the truth, in the basic goodness of people. That faith would be his undoing. 2 weeks after Jessica Monroe's funeral, Michael was officially arrested. The charge, first-degree murder. The evidence was laughably thin. A grainy video, a hoodie, a few whispers strung together by desperation. But it was enough. The public needed a villain. The police needed a conviction. And Michael Turner, quiet, awkward Michael, was an easy target. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he caught Emily's face in the crowd, her mouth trembling with silent protest. He tried to hold on to her gaze, to anchor himself against the rising tide of fear and betrayal. But even Emily's faith couldn't protect him from what was coming. Michael Turner had spent his life believing that if you worked hard and did the right thing, the world would be fair. He was about to learn how wrong he had been. The morning of Michael Turner's trial felt heavier than any day before. Thick grey clouds pressed low against the courthouse, and a damp chill clung to the air, as if the world itself sensed that something profoundly wrong was about to happen. Michael sat alone at the defense table, his suit a size too big, his tie slightly crooked. Emily Sanders sat behind him, her hands wringing the strap of her purse until her knuckles turned white. District Attorney Robert Mills delivered the opening statement with all the subtlety of a hammer blow. He painted Michael as a loner, an outsider, someone with a hidden rage that had finally erupted in violence. Michael Turner, Mills declared to the jury, is not the man he pretended to be. Behind the quiet smile was a predator waiting for the perfect opportunity. Michael listened in stunned silence. Each word chipped away at the person he thought the town knew. He wasn't even sure if the people in the jury box could hear his own heartbeat over the prosecutor's thundering voice, but to Michael it was deafening. The prosecution's witnesses were a parade of shaky memories and biased assumptions. A gas station attendant testified that Michael often walked by late at night, implying something sinister about his habits. A former classmate said Michael gave her a weird feeling back in high school. None of it amounted to real evidence, but it didn't need to. Fear and familiarity were more powerful than facts in Brookhaven. Michael's court-appointed attorney, a tired man named Carl Denton, made little effort to counter the narrative. He raised objections half-heartedly, stumbled through cross-examinations, and seemed more eager to reach a plea deal than to fight for his client's freedom. Michael felt trapped, not just by the charges, but by the realization that no one truly believed he could be innocent. The key piece of evidence, the blurry surveillance footage, was presented as the prosecution's crown jewel. The figure in the video was indistinct, their face obscured by the low lighting and distance. Still, the hoodie was similar to one Michael owned. That was enough for Mills. That was enough for most. During recess, Michael caught his reflection in the courthouse window. His own eyes looked unfamiliar, hollow, frightened, worn down by months of accusations. Max, his loyal dog, had been rehomed after his arrest. His apartment was gone, his savings drained by legal fees. The life he'd built was reduced to a news headline and a manila folder of court documents. When it came time for Michael to testify, he stood and walked to the witness stand with leaden feet. He told the truth in a voice that cracked with emotion. He had been home studying. He didn't know Jessica Monroe personally. He had nothing to hide. But truth sounded fragile next to Mills's performance, next to the town's need for closure. The prosecutor painted Michael's calmness as coldness, his nervousness as guilt. The jury deliberated for just under 4 hours. When they returned, the air in the courtroom seemed to thicken. Michael gripped the edge of the defense table, bracing himself. "Guilty," the foreperson announced. The word echoed in Michael's ears, hollow and final. Emily gasped behind him, tears streaming down her face. Michael sat frozen as the judge sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted. Jessica's family wept openly. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, flashes from their cameras illuminating Michael's blank, disbelieving face. He barely registered the bailiff's hand on his shoulder, guiding him out of the room like a broken puppet. In the holding cell, he sat in silence, the buzz of fluorescent lights humming overhead. The walls seemed to close in around him. For the first time since his arrest, he allowed the horror of it all to consume him. Not anger, just a deep, aching sorrow. He had trusted the system. He had believed that if he stayed calm, told the truth, and faced his fears head-on, justice would prevail. Instead, he had been devoured by it. As the cell door slammed shut behind him, Michael realized something even more devastating. It wasn't just the bars that would trap him. It was the story Brookhaven had written about him, and no truth could ever fully erase it. The news of Michael Turner's conviction spread through Brookhaven like a wildfire. It was as if the town exhaled a collective sigh of relief, convinced that the threat had been eliminated. Headlines plastered local newspapers. "Justice served in Monroe murder case." The evening news ran footage of Michael being led away in handcuffs, his face pale and hollow. Inside the Turner family home, there was only silence. Michael's distant relatives, who had once sent birthday cards and polite invitations to holiday dinners, disappeared. No letters, no calls. Nothing but a void where a family used to be. Emily Sanders, however, refused to abandon him. She attended every court date, every hearing, her faith in Michael unwavering even when the rest of the world branded him a monster. After the sentencing, she visited him in the county jail as often as the schedule allowed. But every time she saw him through the thick glass, something inside her broke a little more. The vibrant, hopeful man she knew was fading, day by day, into a shadow. Michael tried to stay strong during those visits. He spoke about appealing the conviction, about proving the truth. But Emily could see the weariness in his eyes, the growing doubt he tried so hard to hide. Prison life was brutal. Michael, once kind and soft-spoken, quickly learned that kindness was seen as weakness behind bars. He kept his head down, avoided confrontations, but it wasn't enough. Fights erupted around him daily. Sometimes he got caught in the crossfire, sometimes he was the target. Every scar he earned inside those walls was another reminder that the system had not only stolen his freedom, it was actively trying to erase who he was. The correctional officers weren't much better. To them, Michael was just another number. His protests of innocence fell on deaf ears. One guard, in particular, seemed to take pleasure in reminding him day after day that everyone's innocent in here, kid. Time inside moved differently. Weeks blurred into months, months into years. Michael marked the days on a small calendar taped to the wall of his tiny cell, each X a silent scream for the life he once had. Back in Brookhaven, life went on without him. Jessica Monroe's parents became vocal advocates for victims' rights, appearing on talk shows and pushing for harsher sentences for violent offenders. They never mentioned Michael by name, but the implication was clear. He became the cautionary tale, the warning whispered to young girls walking home alone. Weller's Market, once Michael's second home, changed ownership. The new management repainted the walls and replaced the familiar bell over the door. It was as if Michael Turner had never existed. The town celebrated holidays, hosted parades, and resumed its rhythms, rarely giving a second thought to the man who languished behind bars because they had needed someone to blame. Emily tried to fight for him, organizing fundraisers, speaking to anyone who would listen, but doors slammed in her face more often than not. People didn't want to revisit the case. They wanted it buried, just like Jessica. Michael's health began to deteriorate. Years of stress, poor nutrition, and constant fear took their toll. He developed chronic migraines, stomach ulcers, and a persistent cough that no prison doctor took seriously. The vibrant young man with dreams of becoming a lawyer was slipping away, replaced by someone Emily barely recognized. One evening, during a particularly harsh winter, Emily sat across from him during visiting hours. He looked smaller somehow, hunched under the weight of invisible chain. "I'm still fighting, Michael," she said, tears threatening to spill over. He smiled weakly, the corners of his mouth barely lifting. "I know you are," he whispered, "but maybe it's time to stop. Maybe this is just how it's meant to be." Those words shattered her. She left the prison that night with a resolve hardened by grief. If Michael had given up, she wouldn't. Not yet. But deep inside, even Emily knew the truth. The damage was already done. Even if his name were cleared, even if the real killer were found, Michael Turner would never get those lost years back. He would never again be the man who once believed so fiercely in fairness and justice. In a forgotten corner of Brookhaven Cemetery, there was a small plot reserved for unclaimed bodies. Michael sometimes wondered if that's where he would end up, a man erased, reduced to nothing more than a cautionary footnote in a town desperate to forget its own failures. And in the end, perhaps that was the cruelest punishment of all. Not the bars, not the beatings, not even the wrongful conviction. It was being forgotten. If Michael's story is already making you feel something, anger, sadness, hope, take a moment to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, just like his. Together, we can shine a light on stories that should never be forgotten. Jonathan Pryce wasn't the kind of journalist who chased fame. He had built his career on quiet persistence, digging into old cases that everyone else had forgotten. He believed that some stories deserved to be told, even when no one was listening anymore. It was this stubborn dedication that led him to Brookhaven. Jonathan first heard about Michael Turner's case during a seminar on wrongful convictions. An offhand comment from a guest speaker, "Small towns can be the worst when they get it wrong," sent him down a rabbit hole. The more he read, the more uneasy he felt. The evidence against Michael was paper-thin, built on shaky testimony and public hysteria rather than concrete facts. Most troubling of all was the surveillance footage, the prosecution's so-called smoking gun. Jonathan tracked down a copy buried deep in court archives. He watched it frame by frame, over and over. The figure in the hoodie moved differently than Michael, whose gait Jonathan had seen in video clips from the trial. It was subtle but unmistakable. A slight limp, a heavier build. How had no one noticed? Jonathan reached out to Sarah Whitmore, a criminal defense attorney known for taking cases others called hopeless. Skeptical at first, Sarah agreed to review the evidence. Within a week, she called Jonathan back, her voice tight with controlled anger. "There's no way that jury should have convicted him," she said. "They didn't convict based on facts. They convicted based on fear." Together, they started digging deeper. Jonathan filed public records requests, combed through police reports, and interviewed anyone still willing to talk. What they found was a pattern of shortcuts and negligence. Witness statements that had been coerced, potential leads that were ignored, forensic tests that were never properly analyzed. Most damning was an internal police memo Jonathan uncovered through a whistleblower. Dated just 2 weeks after Jessica Monroe's death, it mentioned a suspicious man seen near the park, a man who closely matched the figure in the surveillance video. The report had been quietly buried, never introduced at Michael's trial. Jonathan's hands shook as he read it. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a deliberate choice to ignore anything that didn't fit the narrative. He knew then that Michael Turner had been sacrificed for the sake of convenience. Still, evidence alone wasn't enough. They needed someone inside the original investigation to speak up. That's when Jonathan found Officer David Klein. Klein had been a junior patrolman back when the case broke, barely out of the academy. Haunted by guilt, he agreed to meet Jonathan in a dingy diner off the interstate. Over coffee gone cold, Klein confirmed what Jonathan feared. They had doubts about Michael from the beginning, but pressure from higher-ups, the community and media frenzy forced them to shut down alternative leads. "They just wanted it over," Klein muttered, staring into his cup. "They wanted to tell people they caught the guy, even if it wasn't the right one." Jonathan recorded everything. With Sarah's help, they began drafting a motion to reopen the case, citing new evidence and witness testimony. But they knew it wouldn't be easy. Brookhaven had moved on. Reopening old wounds would make enemies. Jonathan didn't care. Neither did Sarah. Some truths were too important to stay buried. They sent the file to the appellate court, attaching a detailed report on all the inconsistencies, the buried memo, and Officer Klein's statement. Now, it wasn't just about saving Michael Turner. It was about holding an entire system accountable. As Jonathan clicked send on the final submission, he allowed himself a small, fragile hope. For the first time in years, someone was finally listening. When the motion to reopen Michael Turner's case landed on Judge Helen Marshall's desk, it caused an immediate ripple through the Brookhaven legal community. Judge Marshall was known for her no-nonsense attitude and a deep respect for due process. She prided herself on being immune to public pressure, something Brookhaven had sorely lacked during Michael's original trial. The evidence Jonathan Price and Sarah Whitmore presented was too compelling to ignore. A buried police report, a credible witness coming forward, a mountain of procedural failures that tainted the original investigation. Judge Marshall ordered a preliminary hearing. It was the first glimmer of hope Michael had seen in almost 7 years. In prison, Michael received the news from his new defense team. At first, he didn't react. It was as if the part of him that dared to hope had long since withered. But Emily Sanders, who sat beside him during the meeting, squeezed his hand and whispered, "You're not invisible anymore." And slowly, Michael allowed himself to believe. The town of Brookhaven, however, wasn't ready to admit it might have made a mistake. Whispers turned into open hostility. Editorials ran with headlines like, "Why dig up the past?" and "Justice was already served." Many residents treated the new investigation as a personal attack, a threat to the comforting fiction they had built around Jessica Monroe's death. Still, Sarah Whitmore pressed forward. She filed motions, demanded new forensic tests, subpoenaed old case files. She treated the case like a puzzle that had been forced to fit the wrong way, and now she was determined to set it right. Jonathan Pryce, meanwhile, published a series of articles exposing the holes in the original trial. His pieces were factual but devastating, painting a picture of a community so desperate for closure that it abandoned fairness altogether. Slowly, national attention began to turn toward Brookhaven. With pressure mounting, the district attorney's office had no choice but to cooperate, at least on the surface. During the new hearings, damning revelations came to light. The hoodie that had supposedly linked Michael to the crime, DNA testing, finally conducted properly, showed no trace of Jessica Monroe or Michael Turner. The timeline of events, once considered ironclad, fell apart under scrutiny. Witnesses admitted that police had led them during interviews, suggesting answers rather than allowing memories to emerge naturally. But the most shocking moment came when Officer David Klein took the stand. Nervous but resolute, he testified under oath about the internal pressure to close the case quickly. He described how alternative leads were dismissed without proper investigation and how officers were discouraged from raising doubts about Michael's guilt. The courtroom fell silent as Klein spoke. Even Judge Marshall leaned forward, her expression unreadable. The truth was finally crawling into the light, no matter how much Brookhaven tried to avert its eyes. Michael attended the hearings in shackles, sitting quietly at the defense table, but those who watched closely could see the change in him. Small at first, but growing, a straighter posture, a clearer gaze. Hope was dangerous in prison. It could hollow you out when dashed. But for the first time in years, hope didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like a key. Outside the courthouse, supporters began gathering. Small groups at first, holding handmade signs that read, "Justice for Michael" and "Truth Matters." Emily stood among them, rain soaking her jacket, her hands red from the cold, but her spirit unbreakable. Inside, Sarah Whitmore made her final argument to Judge Marshall. "This isn't just about Michael Turner," she said, voice steady but thick with emotion. "It's about a system that failed, because it valued speed over truth, assumption over evidence. We can't undo the years he's lost, but we can stop this injustice from continuing 1 second longer." Judge Marshall called for a recess. The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy. For Michael, every tick of the clock felt like an earthquake beneath his feet. He had waited years for someone to believe him. Now he waited to see if belief would finally be enough. The day Judge Helen Marshall was scheduled to deliver her decision, Brookhaven was wrapped in a heavy, misty rain that clung to the streets and windows like a stubborn memory. Inside the courthouse, a tension filled the air so thick it felt almost alive, pressing down on every person who entered the cramped wood-paneled courtroom. Michael Turner sat at the defense table, hands folded tightly in front of him, his wrists free of shackles for the first time in years. Emily Sanders sat in the front row of the gallery, barely breathing, her hands clutched together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Jonathan Pryce and Sarah Whitmore exchanged a silent glance, both understanding the enormity of what was about to unfold. The courtroom, once packed with spectators eager to watch Michael's downfall, now held a different crowd. Supporters who had read Jonathan's articles, advocates from innocence projects, and curious townspeople unsure if they had misjudged a man they once condemned. Judge Marshall entered, her black robe billowing slightly behind her. She wasted no time with pleasantries. She adjusted her glasses, cleared her throat, and began. "This court has reviewed all newly submitted evidence, testimonies, and procedural inconsistencies from the original trial," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "It is clear that a miscarriage of justice has occurred. Mr. Turner was not afforded a fair trial. Given the weight of the new evidence, this court has no choice but to vacate the conviction and order his immediate release." For a moment, no one moved. The words seemed too large, too impossible to absorb at once. Michael blinked, stunned into silence. Emily gasped, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. Sarah Whitmore exhaled, her hand gripping the edge of the table as if to steady herself. Jonathan Pryce smiled for the first time in weeks, scribbling a single word at the top of his notepad. Freedom. The bailiff stepped forward to unlock the last remaining symbol of Michael's imprisonment, the bracelet around his ankle. It clicked open and fell to the floor with a soft metallic clatter that echoed louder than any gavel strike ever could. Michael stood slowly, his legs trembling under the weight of the moment. He turned to face the gallery, where Emily had risen to her feet, hands covering her mouth. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and for a second it felt like the walls fell away, leaving only the two of them, and the years of pain, hope, and perseverance that had led to this fragile, beautiful moment. He took a single step forward, and Emily rushed to meet him, throwing her arms around his shoulders. Michael froze for a heartbeat, overwhelmed, before hugging her back with a fierce, desperate strength he hadn't known he still possessed. Applause broke out, not loud, but steady and growing. A few hands at first, then more, until the entire gallery was on its feet, clapping for the man they had once allowed to be buried alive. Outside the courthouse, the rain had eased to a soft drizzle. The doors opened, and Michael stepped out into the open air, feeling the cold dampness against his skin, breathing in air that tasted different, cleaner, freer. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, microphones shoved in his direction. "Michael, how does it feel to be free? What do you plan to do now? Do you forgive the town?" He didn't answer at first. He just stood there, letting the rain wash over him, grounding himself in the simple, astonishing fact of freedom. Finally, he turned to the crowd, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "I was innocent the day they took me," he said. "I'm innocent today, but what matters now isn't just my story. It's making sure this never happens to anyone else." There was a pause, and then another round of applause. Softer this time, more solemn, more real. Michael and Emily made their way down the courthouse steps. Jonathan Pryce walked a few steps behind, already planning his next article, not just about Michael Turner, but about the cracks in the system that had tried to destroy him. Sarah Whitmore, who had risked her reputation on a case everyone else had abandoned, watched them go with a quiet satisfaction. But for Michael, the road ahead wasn't simple. Freedom was only the first step. The world he returned to was not the one he had left behind. Brookhaven remained divided. Some people welcomed him home, ashamed of how easily they had turned their backs. Others avoided his gaze, still unwilling to admit they had been wrong. Michael didn't care about their approval anymore. He didn't need it. What he needed was time. Time to heal. Time to find out who he was now after everything he had endured. Emily remained at his side, steady and patient, offering him the one thing he needed most: unconditional belief. As they walked away from the courthouse, Michael thought about all the nights he had spent staring at the cracks in his prison cell wall, dreaming of this day. He had imagined it so many times, but the reality was both heavier and lighter than he had ever expected. Freedom wasn't a moment, it was a lifetime he had to rebuild, one small, uncertain step at a time. And for the first time in years, Michael Turner had something he had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. The news of Michael Turner's exoneration sent shockwaves through Brookhaven. For many, it felt like waking from a long, uneasy dream, one where they had played roles they now wished they could forget. At the Brookhaven Police Department, the mood was tense and defensive. Behind closed doors, officers who had once proudly paraded Michael's mugshot through the media now exchanged nervous glances, wondering if their careers were at risk. Some justified their actions by blaming the prosecution. Others privately admitted their doubts had been silenced by the overwhelming demand for quick answers. District Attorney Robert Mills, who had so confidently led the charge against Michael, held a brief press conference the day after the release. His tone was measured, almost robotic. "We respect the court's decision," he said. "We stand by the hard work of our investigators, but we recognize that mistakes were made." It was a politician's apology, carefully worded, deliberately hollow. He offered no personal regret, no acknowledgement of the life he had helped destroy. The public's reaction was split down the middle. Some residents of Brookhaven lined up outside Michael's new temporary apartment to leave cards, flowers, and notes of apology. Strangers donated groceries, offered rides, even job opportunities. Others, however, clung stubbornly to their original beliefs. Conspiracy theories circulated in online forums, claims that Michael had somehow manipulated the new evidence, that the real killer had been protected by outsiders, that the justice system had bowed to political correctness. For them, admitting Michael's innocence meant confronting their own complicity, and not everyone was willing to do that. At Weller's Market, the atmosphere was uncomfortable. The store had been sold twice since Michael's arrest, but old employees still remembered how easily they had distanced themselves from him. A few sent private messages to Emily, apologizing for how they had treated him. Most remained silent, letting guilt fester in the quiet corners of their lives. For Jessica Monroe's family, the news was devastating. They had spent years believing they had closure, that their daughter's death had been avenged. Now they were faced with a terrible void, a question that reopened every old wound. If not Michael, then who? Jessica's mother, Linda Monroe, issued a statement through the family's lawyer. "Our hearts are broken all over again. We grieve not only for Jessica, but for the truth that was denied. We pray that the real perpetrator will be brought to justice." Michael read their words carefully, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and solidarity. He didn't blame them. They had lost something irreplaceable, and they had been betrayed by the same system that had betrayed him. Meanwhile, Jonathan Pryce's articles continued to gain national attention. He appeared on talk shows, radio programs, podcasts, telling Michael's story, exposing Brookhaven's failures, and pushing for broader reforms in the criminal justice system. Jonathan was careful, though. He never portrayed Michael as simply a victim. He highlighted Michael's resilience, his quiet strength, the humanity that had survived even when everything else had been stripped away. Sarah Whitmore also found her profile rising. Other wrongfully convicted individuals reached out to her, hoping she could do for them what she had done for Michael. But Sarah remained grounded, refusing to bask in the spotlight. She reminded everyone that Michael's freedom was just the beginning, that true justice would require systemic change. For Michael himself, life outside prison was disorienting. The world had moved on without him in ways big and small. Technology had leapt forward. Neighborhoods had changed. Friends had married, had children, moved away. He found it hard to trust even simple kindness. A friendly cashier, a neighbor's wave, an offer of help, each gesture carried a shadow of suspicion. Emily remained his anchor. Patient and steadfast, she helped Michael navigate the labyrinth of re-entry, applying for identification, opening a bank account, finding part-time work. Slowly, painfully, he began to stitch a life together from the shredded remains of his old one. Therapy sessions became part of his routine. At first, Michael hated them, the sterile rooms, the probing questions. But over time, he found value in putting words to the pain he had carried alone for so long. The nightmares didn't vanish, but they became less suffocating. The panic attacks that once paralyzed him began to loosen their grip. One evening, months after his release, Michael stood outside the Brookhaven Community Center, staring at a hand-painted sign, "Town Hall Criminal Justice Reform Forum tonight." Emily nudged him gently. "You don't have to speak if you're not ready," she said. Michael hesitated. Then he stepped inside. The room was half full. Townspeople, students, a few local officials, and reporters. When Michael was introduced, the room fell into a respectful hush. He approached the microphone slowly, heart pounding. "I used to believe that telling the truth was enough," he began. His voice was steady, though his hands trembled slightly. "I believed that if you were honest and good, the world would see that. But I learned the hard way that truth alone isn't always louder than fear or hate." He paused, scanning the faces before him. I lost 7 years of my life because people chose fear over facts. Because it was easier to point a finger than to ask hard questions. But I'm not here tonight to ask for your sympathy. I'm here to ask for your courage. The courage to look closer, to listen harder, to remember that every person you rush to judge is a human being just like you. The applause that followed was soft at first, then grew stronger. For the first time, Michael Turner wasn't just a man cleared of a crime he didn't commit. He was a voice, one that Brookhaven couldn't silence anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real victory. Michael Turner's story left Brookhaven with wounds that would take years to heal, if they ever fully healed at all. In the quiet aftermath of his release, the town found itself forced into a long overdue reckoning, not just with the justice system, but with its own conscience. People began to question the assumptions they had once accepted without hesitation. They remembered how easily they had been swept up in fear, how quickly they had surrendered their doubts for the comfort of a simple narrative, good versus evil, guilty versus innocent. It was easier to believe Michael was a monster than to confront the idea that true monsters sometimes hide behind collective silence and misplaced trust. Church sermons spoke about the dangers of judging without understanding. Schools introduced programs on critical thinking and media literacy, teaching students not to accept the loudest voices as truth. Brookhaven's police department initiated internal reforms, new training on evidence handling, better procedures for interrogations, a renewed focus on protecting civil rights. Still, for every step forward, there were those who resisted, clinging tightly to old prejudices. Change, real change, was slow, painful, and incomplete. But Michael's survival and his courage to speak out planted a seed of possibility. His case became a cautionary tale repeated across courtrooms and classrooms, a living reminder that justice demanded more than a verdict. It demanded vigilance. It demanded humility. The willingness to admit that sometimes even the best intentions could lead to devastating consequences. For Michael, the greatest lesson was both brutal and beautiful. He learned that the truth was not a shield strong enough to protect him from injustice, but it was the only weapon he had to reclaim his life. He learned that silence could be as dangerous as cruelty, that good people could do terrible things when blinded by fear. But he also discovered something else, the immense power of resilience. No system, no institution, no mob could erase the simple, stubborn fact that he had survived. They could take his time, his reputation, even his health, but they could not take his humanity. In a world quick to discard those it misunderstands, Michael Turner stood as proof that dignity, once reclaimed, was stronger than any chain. And perhaps that was the deepest truth Brookhaven and all who heard his story needed to understand. Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about protecting the innocent, especially when it's hardest to believe they exist. In the months following his release, Michael Turner faced the difficult task of rebuilding a life from pieces he barely recognized. Freedom was not the end of his journey. It was only the beginning of a long, uncertain road. At first, Michael stayed with Emily Sanders, who had transformed her spare room into a quiet refuge. She shielded him from reporters and curious neighbors, allowing him the space to breathe, to exist without judgment. Together, they created a new rhythm: morning walks, shared meals, long conversations that sometimes ended in comfortable silence. Michael found work at a small bookstore, run by an older couple who believed in second chances. They never asked about his past. They simply handed him a key and told him where to find the coffee machine. He attended therapy twice a week, confronting the trauma he had carried silently for so long. The nightmares didn't vanish overnight, nor did the instinctive flinch when strangers approached too quickly. But slowly, piece by piece, Michael began to reclaim the parts of himself that had once seemed lost forever. Meanwhile, Brookhaven continued its slow transformation. Under public pressure, the police department reopened the investigation into Jessica Monroe's murder. New leads were explored, and with the help of improved forensic technology, a new suspect was eventually identified. A drifter with a violent past, someone who had slipped through the cracks during the initial panic. It was another wound for Jessica's family, another storm they had to weather. But this time, the community approached it with greater care, greater humility. District Attorney Robert Mills quietly resigned, his reputation permanently tarnished. New leadership promised a different future, though Michael knew promises were fragile things. Jonathan Pryce published a book chronicling Michael's story and the failures that nearly destroyed him. The book sparked national discussions about wrongful convictions, leading to new funding for innocence projects across the country. Michael's name, once synonymous with scandal, now stood for resilience and justice reform. Emily encouraged Michael to speak publicly, and after months of hesitation, he agreed. His speeches were simple, honest, powerful. He didn't shout or accuse. He simply told the truth, the kind of truth that could only come from someone who had lived its consequences. Through it all, Michael remained grounded. He didn't seek revenge or fame. He sought only peace, and in time, he found it. One evening, standing on a hill overlooking the town that had both condemned and freed him, Michael Turner smiled quietly to himself. He hadn't just survived. He had become something more, a living reminder that no matter how deeply injustice roots itself, the truth has a way of breaking through. And sometimes, even after the longest winter, the heart finds its way back to the sun. Michael Turner's story forces all of us to confront uncomfortable questions. How many more innocent lives are lost behind cold prison walls because no one dared to look closer? How often do fear and prejudice shout louder than truth and justice? Now, we want to hear from you. What do you believe is the real root cause of wrongful convictions like Michael's? Is it systemic failure, public pressure, or something deeper within human nature itself? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Every perspective matters, and together these conversations can be the beginning of real change. If Michael's journey moved you, if it opened your eyes or broke your heart, share this video with someone you care about. Let's make sure his story doesn't fade into silence like so many others. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. Every week, we bring you real stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us that behind every headline, there's a human being fighting to be heard. Your voice has power. Use it. Because justice isn't something that happens automatically. It's something we have to fight for every single day. Thank you for being part of this movement. We'll see you in the next story.